It's up to them. If they want to believe supernatural nonsense, that is up to them, but don't force it on the rest of us.
I believe, unlike some of my scientific colleagues, that the question of the existence of God or gods, supernatural beings, is a scientific question, whereas other scientists will say it's nothing to do with science. Science and religion occupy two quite separate magisteria and don't overlap. I think they do overlap. I think they both attempt to answer the same kinds of questions, at least somewhat. The difference is that religion gets the answers wrong.
What's going to happen when I die? If I met God, in the unlikely event after I died, I think the first thing I'd say is, well, which one are you? Are you Zeus? Are you Thor? Are you Baal? Are you Mithras? Are you Yahweh? Which God are you? And why did you take such great pains to conceal yourself and to hide away from us?
Because we've now somehow gone beyond the threshold of death, we're able to study what happens to mind and consciousness when the brain is potentially shut down.
Dr. Sam Parnia has poured over thousands of stories of near-death experiences. He is trying to explain what happens between life and death. Is there a soul?
We can somehow answer this age-old question that people have had for millennia, which is it the brain cells that are producing your consciousness, or is it some other process that we don't understand yet?
He is studying cardiac arrest patients who claim to remember leaving their bodies and witnessing what was going on below. He places pictures high up in the corners of hospital rooms where they cannot be seen by anyone unless they physically leave their body and hover above the scene.
The images vary. What we can then do is simply put an image on this side that's only visible if you're looking from the ceiling down.
But if a brain-dead person is then revived and has memories of being somewhere after clinical death, how can you explain it?
That's why you can't explain away people's experiences as being a dream, because you can't dream or have a hallucination if you're flatlined on your brain. In order for you to hallucinate, you have to have a functioning brain.
Back at 8:37, and in a moment we're going to talk to a doctor who says death is reversible. But first, the question, what happens when we die? Dr. Sam Parnia is one of the world's leading experts on the study of death and these near-death experiences. His new book is called Erasing Death. Dr. Parnia, good morning. It's good to see you.
Good morning. Good to be here.
Lots to talk about in this book. Let's pick it up right there, though, with these near-death experiences. You well know that you have many colleagues in the scientific community who doubt this, who they say this is basically hallucinations that are brought on by lack of oxygen to the brain. As I understand it, you're planning to study this. Tell me about, I've heard about one where you want to actually place some things high up in a hospital room to see if that out-of-body experience is real?
Well, you see, I'm an intensive care physician. My goal is to bring people back to life. That's my aim. But in order to do that, we have to study what happens after death. And an inadvertent consequence of this, the flip side of the coin, is that we've learned about what people experience after death. So that's why we know that when people die, their consciousness is not annihilated, and that there are these experiences.
Yeah. Well, it will be interesting to see the results of that study.
I want to come back to the question of out-of-body experiences because, Sam, I know you have been the director of a study called the AWARE study, which is actually trying to check on this in some scientific way to see if there's a way to prove that the mind is more than just brain function. Do you want to tell us about your study?
Not right now. I just wanted to actually, before we can do that, I just need to touch back on, it's important for everyone to understand what we're talking about. I deal with cardiac arrests every week. I've resuscitated hundreds, if not more, of patients, and it's my bread and butter. It's what I do for a living. And the important thing which Peter was alluding to is to understand that actually, while there are many things that make people become very sick, but with cardiac arrest, it's understood very well because we have to understand the physiology in order to be able to bring people back and preserve their brain. So as Kevin mentioned, when you have, at the beginning, when blood flow to the brain gets beyond a certain threshold, then the brain does not function. Now, when someone's heart stops, immediately, when there is no pumping of the heart, there is no blood, zero blood getting into the brain. And immediately, a patient will develop fixed and dilated pupils. They lose all of their brainstem reflexes, which is why we can put a tube into their airway and they don't gag. And their brain stops functioning completely within seconds. Now, when we do resuscitation, with the best of efforts that we make, we can only get a little bit of blood, 5% of the blood that the person has ordinarily into the brain. And that's why throughout the entire period of resuscitation, the brain remains flatlined. And the pupils remain fixed and dilated. The brainstem does not function. The only cases where that may be an exception is if we have transiently restarted the heart and we lose it again. But when the heart doesn't beat, that's the case. Now, interestingly, to go to your question of consciousness, what we have is that we have many thousands, if not millions of people now who are reporting these incredible experiences from all over the world, many of whom have described our doctors, our nurses, conversations of what was going on. But you cannot have a functioning cortex in this time. It's not possible. So we're left with a paradox. So this led us to put together a more definitive study, which we call awareness during resuscitation, to try to iron out some of these issues. And part of that was to try to study the quality of oxygen getting into the brain and hopefully improve outcomes for our patients so they don't end up brain damage. And part of it was also to try to study these recollections that people have. Now, our study has been analyzed, and we will be releasing the results soon. But I can just give a little snippet, if I may, just because everyone asks us. And what we have found, and this is not just my interpretation, these are experts. We have at least 20 experts from neurology to psychiatry to various fields in neuroscience to emergency medicine who have conferred the findings that essentially our data suggests that these so-called out-of-body experiences, at least when they occur in the cardiac arrest setting, which is why I call them visual awareness, cannot be defined as a hallucination. They cannot be defined as a hallucination. They are not consistent with what we call a hallucination.
I have an impolite question to ask each of you. It's one of the pleasures of having my job here is I get to ask you pointed questions. And so here's the question. And what I'm looking for here is a very simple answer, a yes, a no, or a maybe. Your best guess, does consciousness exist after death? Sam?
Okay. So here we are. We just said that.
Your best guess. We're speculating.
We don't know exactly what you mean by death when it's become permanent stuff. But I would say that the way that we've traditionally perceived death, the way that philosophers have written about it, poets have written about it, movies show it, etc., that after a person reaches that point, yes, consciousness continues at least for tens of minutes, if not hours of time. And beyond that, we simply cannot measure or study it at this point. Maybe in 50 years we can. Was that short enough? Like I said, you asked a $1 million question in 5 seconds.
Let's say one day you met a person who has achieved enlightenment, and you could ask this person 3 questions, any questions you want. what would they be? Mine would probably be, what is the meaning of life? Why is Kim Kardashian a celebrity? What happens after you die? So we all die. That's something we all have in common. I mean, as soon as you're born, the countdown begins. If you think about it, birthdays, the day you celebrate and eat cake, they're just markers to your eventual death. Of course, different religions and beliefs talk about what happens after you die, and the options are basically heaven, hell, reincarnation, or you're just dead. Usually science, which if you think about it, is itself a belief system, you just die. Nothing else happens, you're in the ground and you're warm food. But now a scientific study supports the notion that there may actually be life after death. Researchers at the University of Southampton conducted the largest ever medical study into near-death and out-of-body experiences, and has discovered that some awareness may continue even after the brain has shut down. Researchers spent 4 years examining more than 2,000 people who suffered cardiac arrest at 15 hospitals in the UK, US, and Austria, and they found that nearly 40% of people who survived described some kind of awareness during the time when they were clinically dead before their hearts were restarted. One man even recalled leaving his body entirely and watching his resuscitation from the corner of the room. Despite being unconscious and dead for 3 minutes, the 57-year-old social worker from Southampton recounted the actions of the nursing staff in detail and described the sound of the machines. Dr. Sam Parnia of the State University of New York, who led the study, says that we know the brain can't function when the heart has stopped beating, but in this case, conscious awareness appears to have continued for up to 3 minutes into the period when the heart wasn't beating, even though the brain typically shuts down within 20 to 30 seconds after the heart has stopped. The man described everything that had happened in the room, but importantly, he heard 2 bleeps from a machine that makes a noise at 3-minute intervals, so we could time how long the experience lasted for. He seems very credible, and everything that he said had happened to him had actually happened. Of the 2,060 cardiac arrest patients studied, 330 survived, and of 140 surveyed, 39% said they had experienced some kind of awareness while being resuscitated. Although many could not recall specific details, some themes emerged. 1 in 5 said they had felt an unusual sense of peacefulness, while nearly 1/3 said time had slowed down or speeded up. Some recalled seeing a bright light, a golden flash, or the sun shining. Others recounted feelings of fear or drowning or being dragged through deep water. 13% said they had felt separated from their bodies, and the same number said their senses had been heightened. Dr. Parnia believes many more people may have experiences when they are close to death, but drugs or sedatives used in the process of resuscitation may stop them from remembering.
Near-death experiences are not all that uncommon. Floating out of your body, heading towards a bright white light, it's all been recounted before. Which is why what you're about to hear is so confounding. The man you are about to meet is a man of science, a brain surgeon centred in logic. Which is why his story of having died and gone to heaven is being seriously reported as proof the afterlife does exist. We'll let you be the judge. Here's PJ Madam.
You know, before this, I'd spent 20 years in academic neurosurgery. I thought I had a pretty good idea how the brain works and how it generates consciousness. I'd heard occasional near-death experience stories, and I was certain that there would be some brain explanation.
Eben Alexander is a Harvard-trained neurosurgeon. He put his faith in logic, in rational thought. Then, in 2008, he spent 7 days in a coma. Now, he's a believer.
As a neurosurgeon, has this experience changed your thinking about life?
It has totally changed everything about my thinking.
Most people have some idea of what happens when we die. If you do indeed believe in heaven, it usually involves white clouds, bright lights, mountain tops. Well, Dr. Alexander is a man of science and of medicine. Well, he says he's been to the other side, and now he's back to tell us what it was really like. What you saw, or what you felt, is God. Is that your definition?
Yes.
Were you a man of faith before this?
Before my coma, I had no belief whatsoever in a personal loving God.
Adopted as a baby, Eben grew up in a conventionally Christian family.
If you had asked me before my coma, how much would a patient who was extremely sick and should have died from a severe case of bacterial meningitis, how much would they remember? I would have said nothing. They would not remember a single thing.
That all changed when this life-saving surgeon suddenly found himself facing his own mortality.
November 10, 2008. It didn't really start off as being very good, did it?
No, it was basically like being struck by a freight train. Woke up at 4:30 in the morning, had severe back pain, like nothing I'd ever felt before. It was a very severe meningitis, and the CT scans showed that it coated my entire brain. There wasn't any part of my neocortex that was left unscathed.
For 7 days, Dr. Alexander was in a coma. He was all but lifeless, completely unconscious. Yet he experienced a consciousness that defied all his years of medical training.
Here was this beautiful melody and this light spinning closer and closer. It opened up as a portal into this gorgeous realm that was verdant, waterfalls, colors indescribable, and millions of butterflies flying through, a very ultra-real scene. And then there was a warm breeze blowing through that was like the breath of divine.
In the hospital, his doctors were losing hope.
My physicians were telling my wife that basically she'd be raising our sons alone. My 10-year-old son, Bond, had heard that, realized it was very bad news, came running into my room, pried my eyes open, and, "Daddy, you're going to be okay. Daddy, you're going to be okay. Daddy, you're going to be okay." As if he said it enough, it would make it true.
So your son was calling you back?
I had to come back. I had to claw my way up out of that very deep hole and somehow do whatever was necessary. He was pleading with me.
On the 7th day, against all odds, Dr. Alexander awoke. By medical standards, he made a miraculously quick recovery. But nagging the doctor was how to explain what he'd felt and seen.
This infinite blackness, it was filled with love, and yet also filled with this light from this brilliant orb that was with me, and the divine, loving, infinitely powerful consciousness of the deity that created it all.
I mean, you realize how this sounds, though. It can come across as a bit crazy.
It does. Of course it does. When I was, had first gotten home from the hospital, I'd mentioned some of this to my doctors. They would go, "Oh, yes, you were very sick."
Many scientists say such an experience can't be real. Michael Shermer was once a born-again Christian. Today, he's America's most famous skeptic.
So what do you think really happened? What's the scientific explanation behind his experience?
The scientific explanation behind Alexander's experience is nothing more than a near-death experience, an out-of-body experience, an altered state triggered by a stressful event.
Was it just a fantasy before death? Was it your brain basically telling you you're about to die, and it's a nice way of shutting down all the systems and making it a pleasant way to exit?
Well, it's very important to remember that I had a severe bacterial meningitis that had greatly damaged and destroyed my neocortex, the part of our brain that makes us human, the part that allows for any kind of conscious experience. So that with that amount of destruction, there was no way to have a dream, a hallucination, a fantasy, a confabulation. Those things could not occur because that part of my brain was gone.
It doesn't matter how rare the meningitis, none of that matters, because these things can be triggered by any number of conditions. We know, for example, that in a study of pilots accelerated in a centrifuge as part of their training, thousands of near-death and out-of-body experiences in pilots as they were passing out, as they're passing through that fuzzy borderlands between being consciously awake and being completely unconscious. They report as they are going under, passing through a tunnel, floating out of their body, the white light at the end of the tunnel. So there's certain common themes to these experiences that everybody has because our brains are all wired up through the same neurochemistry.
My rational scientific brain says it's all crazy. And then the other part of me says, look, I know it happened.
Eben Alexander's story is a familiar one for Carmel Bell. In 2009, while at home in Melbourne, she went into cardiac arrest.
The next thing I consciously know is that I looked down and saw me lying in bed on my back. I went, oh, that's me. I must be dead. I found myself in classically, I guess, what is known as heaven. There were stars, just the sky was full of stars. There were two other beings waiting to speak to me. One of these beings was 7 or 8 feet tall with these amazing eyes. That actually turned out to be the Archangel Metatron. And with him was a slightly smaller man who said that he was Jesus.
Who is Metatron?
He's meant to be the voice of God.
Well, even his name, Metatron, it sounds like something out of Transformer.
I know.
Megatron.
That's exactly what I think.
How did you know you'd met Jesus and this archangel? Did they say their names? Or
yes, they did. They introduced themselves.
Okay, I've still got no pulse, mate.
Firemen and paramedics worked desperately to save Carmel. After 47 minutes, they were about to give up.
And all of a sudden, Scotty was doing a compression and the chest dropped on its own. And then the pigmentation of her skin changed. And we all looked at each other and go, wow, we've got a result.
Carmel came back to life but remained unconscious. Months later, once she had recovered, she met her rescuers, Steve, Scott and Gary.
Her first words were pointing at Gary and saying that she recognised him, and then pointing to Steve and saying, I know you, and then pointing to me and saying, I know you, but you had more hair. And at the time that we had the MR call with Carmel, I did have longer hair, and then cut it short. So, yeah, that was a surprise. Yeah, that threw us all back. We thought, wow.
I don't think it's crazy. Wouldn't it be nice when science can actually catch up and, you know, but is it meant to be proved?
There are all kinds.
Attempting to prove it is the job of Dr. Sampania.
From a scientific perspective, we have to accept that these experiences occur. There are millions of cases out there, and it would be unscientific just to reject them.
Here at New York's Stony Brook Hospital, this medical scientist is collecting evidence that consciousness can live on once the brain dies.
Although the person is in fact dead and the brain doesn't function and the heart doesn't function, but the cells inside the brain are still in a potentially viable state. They're almost hibernating.
25 hospitals in Europe and the United States are participating in Dr. Pania's research.
After we die, based on the evidence that we have so far, that entity that makes me into who I am doesn't become annihilated. Does it continue tomorrow or the day after? I don't know. But certainly the first few hours after we die, during that phase when death is reversible, there is no evidence that it's annihilated. It's also important, though, to realize that the interpretation of the experience depends on a person's background. So, for instance, if a Hindu in India has a near-death experience and sees a being of light, then they will interpret that potentially as being Krishna or one of the Hindu deities. Whereas if somebody, say, in Australia who's a Christian, or in America who's a Christian, has an experience, they may perceive that they saw Jesus.
One of their tests of whether out-of-body experiences really happen is to place photos like this butterfly high above critically ill patients on the operating table.
And the idea is very simple. If we get a group of people who come back and claim to have seen us, we want to know whether they also see the images as well.
It was one vivid image seen by Dr. Alexander that finally convinced him that what he'd experienced was real.
There was a beautiful girl beside me on the butterfly wing. I can remember her face so perfectly, these sparkling blue eyes and light brown hair and this loving smile, and she never said a word, but her thoughts went right into me. You are loved, you are cherished dearly forever. There's nothing to fear. I knew her face so well, but I'd never met her in my life.
This is the woman Eben saw. Her name is Betsy. After Eben was adopted, his biological parents went on to have more children, including Betsy. She died in 1998. They never met, and it was only after his coma that the family sent him this photo.
And it was the very same girl who had been on the butterfly wing. And her face in the picture was almost mocking me, like, do you finally get it?
People want to believe. They want to think there's an afterlife, everything's going to be great, everybody loves you, all justice will be served, and everything will be made right in the end. I mean, who wouldn't want to believe that? I would like to believe, but what's more important for me is what's actually true.
I saw things I couldn't understand, couldn't explain, and I figured someday there would be a brain-based scientific explanation. Now I know there's a much easier, simpler, more straightforward explanation. That is that our soul is eternal, that our spirit lives forever.
And you can read more about Dr. Alexander's experience in his book Proof of Heaven, which is out now.
What's going to happen when I die? If I met God in the unlikely event after I died, I think the first thing I'd say is, well, which one are you? Are you Zeus? Are you Thor? Are you Baal? Are you Mithras? Are you Yahweh? Which God are you? And why did you take such great pains to conceal yourself and to hide away from us?